This is the first lesson on the depth study, which looks at Germany and the immediate aftermath of the end of the First World War. The depth study goes from 1918, so really effectively from the last year of the First World War until the end of the Second World War in 1945, and looks at the reasons for and the state of Germany, both in its pre-Nazi era and during the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945. We start in 1918 because really to get a sense of why the Nazis came to power, which is the essential theme of this course, that is the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, you need to understand what came before them. What was the situation in a country that allowed something so horrible as the Nazi movement to grow and flourish and to become easily the most popular movement by the late 1920s in a country that until this point showed no signs of going in that particular direction. So to get that, we have to start back in 1918. Now, before even getting into the war, it's probably good to sort of lay the groundwork of where it came from. Before the First World War, so the time between 1871, when Germany was unified into the Germany we sort of conceptually understand today, before that point it was a series of different states. There was a Prussian state, a Bavarian state, et cetera, et cetera. This was unified under Otto von Bismarck in 1871, and between 1871 and 1914, or actually even 1918, Germany is led by a king. Known as the Kaiser. The Kaiser traditionally was the King of Prussia. And by the time the First World War rolls around, the Kaiser's name is Kaiser Wilhelm II. And the era of the time between the First World War and the unification of Germany is known as the Second Reich. Reich is a German word that means empire. So when Hitler comes to power, he is the head of the Third Reich, or the Third German Empire. The first empire, if you're curious, was that of Frederick the Great in the Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages. Other people and historians will often refer to the period before the First World War as the Kaiser Reich, as the empire led by the Kaiser or the king. It is a system of government that looked a little bit democratic, but really ultimately had the king in charge. And the king had veto power over everything and anything in this country. Nothing could be done that went against the will of the king. So even though they do have an elected body known as the Reichstag or parliament, that parliament's decisions, unlike the decisions of a parliament in, let's say, Great Britain or France at this time, were not paramount. In other words, the parliament could make a decision, and if it went against the interests of the king would simply overrule it and make a new decision, and everyone had to abide by that. This government also had a chancellor. This is probably the second person in charge, and because the Kaiser effectively was a lazy man, and Kaiser Wilhelm II wasn't too interested in the business of governance, he preferred hunting, the chancellor did a lot of the work, and below the chancellor you had the Reichstag, and attached to all of this, but separate and responsible only to the Kaiser, was the position of the German army, and the German army is and will continue to be an incredibly important element in the governance and the sort of management of the government of Germany. The army leadership is incredibly powerful, and it has a huge influence on the German government. That's why, in many ways, a lot of historians blame militarism and the idea that, expansion through war as in Germany, and that concept being prominent in Germany for the causes of World War I. And that's a story for another day. Now, what do we know about German society up until this point? Number one, it was incredibly split. Most Germans are very patriotic, they're faithful, i.e. Christian, church-going people, and they're pretty loyal to the Kaiser's government. But on the other hand, there's also a large minority of people who are influenced of ideas of fairness, equality, modernism, and particularly communism. The people who wrote the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, were Germans, and therefore it makes sense that a huge amount of German people in the era up till 1918 were believers that communism, instead of an authoritarian king-led government, was the way forward. But until the war, really the forces of, let's say, conservatism, that of the old traditional way of doing things, were really dominant. But the experience of war, and more particularly the experience of losing a war, which Germany does in 1918, would empower those seeking to change the system. So in other words, when the war is lost and the Kaiser can't maintain power, a lot of Germans who had been sympathetic to the ideas of communism believe that this particularly could be their time. During the war years, the German people submitted to a military rule. The Kaiser was technically in charge, but all aspects of German leadership were turned over to the Army High Command, led by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. To ensure the German war effort was 100%, German people were forced to endure incredible hardship during the war, near starvation, terrible working conditions. There was one winter known as the winter of 1916 to 1917 when the actual rations for German people consisted of 2 turnips a day, and it was known colloquially as the turnip winter, a time of tremendous suffering for the German population. But they were willing to do this for the war effort, and when the war was lost, it felt for a lot of people that their sacrifices, and which were many, and many lived on the brink of starvation, were all in vain. Now, when the war was lost, German conservatives, army officials, and politicians sought to remake Germany into a new political system. They had hoped, and wrongly speaking, that in the last months of the war, if they had changed the way the German government would run, i.e., if they got rid of the Kaiser, it would make the Allies more willing to negotiate a fair and equitable peace treaty. If they could make Germany, for instance, into a democracy or a republic, just like the Allies had, particularly in France, then maybe the French would be willing to negotiate with the Germans on equal terms. They had also hoped that the people angered by years of hardship during the war would not rebel if they moved away from the old system of government. If the people in charge said, okay, if we change the way we run things, maybe the people won't rebel and kill us, like they had rebelled and killed the Tsar and all of his political associates in Russia when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. So the war really turns things around. As I mentioned, the interesting fact of the turnip winter of 1617, a couple things. Germans were forced to survive, and actually it was 1.5 turnips per day. I'll let you read the rest on your own time, but you get the idea that things were pretty darn tough during the war. Now, well, this is really where your course starts, and one of the first things you really need to know is that 2 days before the end of the war, on the 9th of November 1918, the political elites in Germany asked the Kaiser, Wilhelm II of Germany, to step down, or the term for stepping down from the throne is known as abdication. And his autocratic system of rule was replaced with a democracy. Okay. The democracy that was created on the 9th of November, 2 days before the armistice was signed, of course, on the 11th of November 1918, would last from 9 November 1918 to 30th of January 1933, approximately 14 years. And it would be destroyed by the dictatorship that Hitler sets up in the early months of 1933. This democracy was known as the Weimar Republic. Okay? And it had a incredible amount of problems right from its outset. And what you have to know for your course begins here. The Weimar Republic, born 1918, at the end of World War I, ostensibly to try and make the Allies negotiate in equal terms, but to also prevent communist revolution, is really where we start the course, and which lays the foundation, or the failure of the Weimar Republic will lay the foundation for the Nazi Party. The first question you have to know is, was Weimar doomed from the outset? In other words, was the Weimar Republic always destined to fail? What we need to start with really here is how Germany emerged from the defeat at the end of the First World War. A lot of historians throw the idea that Germany experienced a revolution in October and November of 1918. And some historians even go so far as to call it the German Revolution. Your specification notes the fact that you have to learn about the German Revolution and whether there was, well, not necessarily whether there was one, but what were the events that are oftentimes referred to as the German Revolution. And here is the basic understanding of that. And this is really the important point where you should make a couple extra notes if you need to. The German army was being pushed back out of France. In October and November 1918, the British offensive in the last 100 days make more gains in 100 days than had been made in the previous 4 years of the war. They're in complete collapse. They're effectively taking all of their things and they're moving back towards Germany as quickly as possible, lest they be captured or killed by the advancing Allies. In the wake of this army collapse, the German Navy is given orders to sail their ships to the British fleet, and in an all-out suicide mission, basically to protect German honor, they were to sail all of their ships to the British fleet and try and destroy as many as possible, knowing that they would be completely wiped out. Instead, they set fire to their ships, they raise the communist red flag, and they mutiny, and they take over the large German naval base at the city of Kiel. Soldiers and workers' rebellion spread to other German ports and cities, and it looks at near the end of the war, what happened in Russia in 1917 is about to replicate itself here in Germany. It's in the midst of this, and to prevent communism from taking over, that the political elites then approach the Kaiser and ask him to flee to Holland. Now, the Kaiser does flee to Holland. He goes and he lives in Holland for the remainder of his life. He actually dies early in World War II, just after the fall of France in 1940. And of course, the Kaiser is both saddened and encouraged by this, of course, but nevertheless, he's no longer a factor in German politics. He lives in a relative luxury in Holland. And I'll attach an interesting little podcast and video about the way the Kaiser lived in Holland towards the end of the war to this lesson. Now, the German Revolution, or the threat of a German revolution, gives birth to a democratic republic. And a republic is a democracy without a king. The United States is a republic. We are a constitutional monarchy. France is a republic. Okay? Again, we have the Queen as the head of state, so we are technically not, even though we're a democratic country, we have as our head of state a monarch. So as a result, we are what's known as a constitutional monarchy. Germany gets rid of its monarch and therefore becomes a republic. Political power is given in this new republic to the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag. And the largest party in the Reichstag was a group called the SPD, or the Social Democratic Party of Germany. The Social Democrats believe in democracy, but they believe also in socialism. They believe that the best way to achieve something like the society that Marx and Engels envisaged was to do it through the democratic process. And the leader of Germany in this initial stage, in early November 1918, is now the leader of the Social Democratic Party, a man named Friedrich Ebert. The task of this new republic was pretty darn impossible. Number one, they had to restore order. Germany was in chaos. Its armies were running away. And they had to then take this sort of collapsing system of government and collapsing society, restore order, then hold elections for a new parliament. This was going to be pretty hard to do since there was considerable unrest, violence, and political chaos all around Germany. Don't forget, simultaneously, the communists have rebelled in the navy bases, and Germany is effectively almost in a state of revolution. So this republic is born while half the country in itself is trying to establish a communist government like Russia. Restoring order was always going to be incredibly hard for this government because in November 1918, a group known as the Spartacus League springs up. They changed their name to the German Communist Party, which gets the initials of the KPD, in December of 1918. And the Spartacus League was chosen because of the link to the concept of the rebel slaves of the Roman era, led by the rebel slave leader, of course, Spartacus. So they borrow on that idea, and they call themselves the Spartacus League. The Spartacus League made immediate plans to seize power and impose communism over Germany. They were led by two influential revolutionaries, a man named Karl Liebknecht and another one named Rosa Luxemburg, who become sort of famous cult heroes of the communist movement. I believe one was Jewish. I believe Liebknecht was Jewish. I'm not actually sure about Luxemburg. I'll have to look that up. But nevertheless, these two individuals are the leader of this German Communist Party, the KPD, or what's known as the Spartacus League. And the uprising that they attempt in January 1919 to overthrow this new Weimar Republic government is known as the Spartacist Uprising. The Spartacist Uprising had a number of different objectives. The first objective, of course, was to overthrow Ebert's moderate socialist government, which was based on parliament democracy, and their other objective then was to establish a communist-style government based on soldiers and workers' councils, or Soviets as they were known, across towns and cities in Germany. They did not want a national parliament. They wanted the workers to effectively run the country through these social workers' councils. Their methods, they formed a revolutionary committee in January 1919 and began a rebellion by blockading streets and trying to take over government buildings in Berlin and other major centers across Germany. They seized newspaper offices so that they controlled the message of the newspaper, their primary source of information at the time. They organized a general strike, which meant that workers, no matter what industry you happen to work in, be it for the transport system or in the civil service or in the factories that produce any number of things, would all walk off the job at the same time and effectively cripple the economy so the government couldn't do anything about it. They also used armed street fighting. Okay, so they attacked the police and the army who were supporting the government in trying to maintain order. They erected barricades, blockaded city streets, and hoped to establish a government that was effectively overthrowable. And they basically followed the formula that Lenin had done in the October Revolution of 1917, although in Germany much less successfully. The government response to the Spartacus uprising is pretty powerful. The government cuts a deal with the army for support. This is known, for those of you who want to be really particular and want to show up to the examiner, as the Ebert-Groener Agreement. Ebert, the leader of the Weimar Republic government in 1919, and Groener, General Groener, the man who was in charge of the German army at the end of the First World War, cut a deal whereas the army would get a special position in society in return for propping up this new Weimar government. And the army, not really liking either option, the army, of course, really preferred the authoritarian rule of the Kaiser, but decided that the lesser of two evils in this circumstance was probably the new Weimar Republic. So they cut a deal with the Weimar Republic, saying, we'll protect you if you leave us alone. And Ebert agrees, and the army authorizes the formation of these tiny military units, these sort of privately organized units called the Freikorps. In English, that translates to Free Corps because they're free of the constraints of the army leadership, but they are still technically part of the military. And these Free Corps are free to go into the cities, use any means necessary to crush the uprising. And in the Spartacus week of the general uprising of January of 1919, they crush the Spartacus forces in Berlin. Liebknecht and Luxemburg are surrounded in a building, and after a shootout, they're arrested. They're both taken down into a basement and murdered. Their bodies are dumped into the river Spree, not that far from what is now Embassy Row, just off Kurfürstendammstrasse, near the corner of Tiergarten and Fürstendamm. The river Spree cuts through towards the center of Berlin, and the bridge that they threw the bodies of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, after being both mutilated and shot and beat many times by these sort of very insane Free Corps units, into the river there. The government then unleashes the Free Corps across Germany to attack other centers of revolutionary communism. And the Free Corps do an effective, if not a brutal, job of crushing communism. One of the things you got to consider, too, is the fact that the Free Corps units were made up of ex-servicemen, people who had fought for 4 years in the bloody, horrible campaigns on the Western Front. These people had a real bloodlust, and they took out all of their anger and all of their let's say brutality on the communists. Additionally, too, it's also important to note that a lot of people, especially those in the German army and those who were sort of on the right wing of German politics at this point, are beginning to associate the communists with this concept that they were stabbed in the back, that they didn't lose World War I. It was these people at home, these communists who had mutinied, and this sort of rebellion had prevented Germany from fighting on. So they take absolute revenge on the Spartacus, and they're thoroughly crushed. And the reasons for their failure, of course, are manifest. Okay, they were divided over tactics. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were really good at controlling Berlin, but the Spartacus and other German centers took different approaches, and they were easily crushed. Not only that, the fact that their leaders were basically killed really early on in the Spartacus uprising doesn't necessarily help it take hold. Not only that, the brutality and ruthless methods of the Free Corps make anyone interested in fighting on think twice. And a lot of people who aren't killed just run away and abandon the Spartacus movement. But what you see here, and what's important about this, is you need to know that it really showed that this new government the Weimar Republic, had to rely on the services of independent army groups like the Free Corps, over which it had little control. This government was not popular. It was forced to deal with a horrible situation. It had to deal with the consequences of the end of the war. It had to deal with rebellion, but it had to rely on basically small paramilitary units to remain control. People wouldn't listen to the government. This led, of course, to a number of further communist uprisings, because not only the instability but the unpopularity of the government led to a revolution in Bavaria in April of 1919, independent of the Spartacus movement. It was known as the Red Bavaria movement, red being the symbol of the communism or the color of communism. So Red Bavaria tries to turn Bavaria, Germany's second most important and southernmost state, and Bavaria, of course, is where Munich is located, into a communist, basically, effectively country or province in 1919, and this is crushed by the Free Corps. That's an interesting one, actually, and we'll come back to that Bavarian Revolution and the units of the Free Corps, because what you'll find very interestingly is that a young man of about 24 years old finds himself unemployed at the end of the war, and joining a Free Corps unit to crush socialists in Bavaria. And that man's name is Adolf Hitler, who had fought with the Bavarian army and a Bavarian military unit in the German army in the First World War. So we see a little bit of a link, if you will, if you know that Hitler hated communism, to his role in the immediate post-war world, crushing the revolution in Bavaria. And another one pops up in 1920 in the Ruhr Valley in sort of center-west Germany. In March of 1920. It's called the Ruhr Red Rebellion, and it's crushed again, as you can see, in pretty brutal methods by the picture on the right. Revolutionary communism isn't eliminated in Germany, and it becomes a fearful threat throughout the time of the Weimar Republic, but its power is significantly reduced. Communism itself will remain a significant influence in German politics through the 20s and 30s, which will help create, in many ways, a dangerous right-wing movement that goes against it. Now, as a last point before I end this lesson, I just wanted to give a point of clarification on the Free Corps. It's a general name for about 200 paramilitary groups, and a paramilitary group isn't a group attached to the regular army. It's a group that behaves like an army unit, but not necessarily working directly for the army, but in many ways condoned by it. These Free Corps were hired by the government and recruited from demobilized soldiers who at the end of the First World War found themselves out of work. And they were dominated, then the people who signed up for them were dominated by right-wing nationalists, people who wanted an old form of conservative government, who wanted to reestablish maybe something like it was before World War I with a Kaiser in charge, or something where the military could be in charge, a right-wing government. And these people, as their sort of raison d'etre, the reason for being, hated communism. The Free Corps brutality in a large way is both due to their World War I training, the desensitivity, the death that they all faced, but also the fact that they hated communists. They saw themselves in many ways as the protectors of Germany from Bolshevism, communism, and the sort of the kernel or the origins of a new German army that would rise up after the First World War. They helped the government forcibly suppress left-wing revolts, even though many of them were hostile themselves and they didn't like the Weimar Republic. They helped the Weimar Republic, and they're made very similar in their form and being to the fascist squads in Italy. Many members of the Free Corps would be the early people who joined Hitler's paramilitary unit, the SA, which of course will evolve into the SS by 1944. So you see some connections here. And why we start in 1918 and 1919 with this course is because you're starting to draw the long-term connections to how Hitler comes to power, or at least the ideas that allow Hitler to come to power. Now that's all for today. A little bit of a long one, but hopefully you didn't take too many notes through that first part, and we'll see you in class.